Connor?
Hey, what's up, man?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. First of all, the first week was super mind-blowing. I like the content and the stuff, and was a lot of to get changes in my brain too.
Yeah.
And the thing I wanted to ask: do you go primarily first on the ISA, and then make your kind of thought process through the pelvis, or the other way around, or
Like which one am I considering more than the other?
yeah, or it's like yeah.
I think if you're thinking about the infrasternal angle, you're like automatically thinking about the pelvis in terms of just like what the infrasternal angle entails. So for example, if I'm a wide infrasternal angle, then I know that that's probably gonna be associated with a wide infrapubic angle, meaning that the pelvis, if you go into a wide infrapubic angle, the pelvis has to go into internal rotation, and it has to go into adduction and extension of the innominate bones. So I think both things are going hand in hand. And once you get enough reps of doing this and learning it and putting it into practical application, I think that you'll find that you'll automatically associate these things together. It's just right now, like tying the dots and like easing yourself in.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks.
Absolutely. Any other questions?
Okay, Connor,
Yeah.
can you hear me? I had a question. I had a talk with David today. I don't know whether you answered it, but I wanted you to show it. The thing is, innominate flexion goes together with counternutation, right?
Yes.
What would it look like if they don't go together? You said it goes together unless there's a compensation. What would that look like?
So I think they're always pretty much going to like, you're never going to have the sacrum nutate and these bones, like this just doesn't happen. It's not how the mechanics work, because the SI joint is literally fused together for that to happen, for lack of a better term. So usually, yes, because I actually did film a video on this that I'll upload, a Q&A one. When this tips back the sacrum, look at the relative action of what happens with the pelvis right here. This is actually a slide today that we're going to get into, and I think it'll help answer your question. But to answer the compensation thing, it's not going to be like you can't have IR of the innominate bone and like counter nutation of the sacrum. Really, that's not, you don't really see that. At least I haven't. So when this tips back into extension, you see how these rotate forward. But once you go into nutation, the sacrum tips forward, these rotate back. I'm looking at this landmark right here and this landmark right here, the ASIS right here, and the PSIS as measurements of what's going on as this rotates back. Does that help?
Yes, that helps.
Okay.
I'll rewatch it.
We have a slide too, and also that video that I'm going to put on the Slack chat, I think will help.
All right, thank you.
Sure. All right, I think we have
quick.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I can probably Google this. I figured while I'm here, just quick, maybe you have a quick answer, better response. I know that nutated is flexion and counter-nutated is extension. Where do those words come from? Because I never heard those in my science program.
I actually don't know. I don't know where they came from. If you Google that, let me know. I'd be really curious to know the answer. I've just always said them, haven't really guessed where they came from.
Gotcha. I'll take a look.
Sure. We have a couple questions in the Slack chat. By the way, this reading right here, it's under ebooks and extras. You go on the main page, there's that like the My Account, Q&A video answers. It's the other one, ebooks and extras. That's where that book is. Question from week 1. You mentioned the Lemark model and used a squat as an example. You mentioned that as the squat gets deeper, counternutation is achieved. However, in the book, The Malalignment Syndrome, he mentions that counternutation is associated with sacroiliac instability, which is explained by the force form and force closure concepts. He mentions that force closure can be achieved. Yes, and both things are correct on that. I've read that book too, really like it. But just to like summarize his concept, what he's saying with the force closure and form closure thing is that as this is really the closed pack position of the pelvis, nutation and IR, which allows for really like stability of the SI joint. And there's a claim made, which I don't know if I totally agree with, but I think it's, I mean, that guy's writing books and I'm not. So maybe he's got something, but he says that this right here, this counter nutation and ER is almost always associated with the SI joint instability, because this is the loose packed and this is the closed packed position right here. So in a squat, remember how little the SI joint moves, right? It's just 2 degrees, right? So we need for this counter nutation to happen at the bottom. That's just like biomechanically what needs to happen. So that doesn't mean that it's unstable. The hardest part of a squat is the sticking point of a squat, which is around 90 degrees of hip flexion. So this is going to happen during the hardest portion. The most force production that needs to happen, you're going to be in that closed pack position, hopefully. But at the bottom, you need to be able to do this. Your pelvic floor needs to drop if you're going to absorb like that force really in the eccentric all the way into the bottom of the hole. So that's why both can be true. And that's also why we need internal rotation to propel through the hardest point of a squat. My question, would you allow for counter nutation if it's associated with instability? I would ask you, in what context is that associated with instability? Like why is it, other than the fact that this person in the book said it, like when would it be unstable? You know what I mean? I think it depends on where, what, when, that kind of stuff. Is it possible to maintain nutation throughout the whole hip flexion? No. It could be if you really wanted to. If you really wanted to like dump your pelvis forward and only squat to like 90 degrees, yeah, I guess you probably could. But if you're talking about the full squat, which you said the whole hip flexion movement, which I'm guessing you're saying you're getting to 120 degrees of hip flexion, nah, you've gotta, if it's gonna be like the real genuine hip flexion, then you have to get here. Thanks, Nathaniel. That's actually pretty interesting. All right, let's get rocking and rolling. I'll answer those other questions in the Slack probably at the end. Okay, week 2. So again, I just want to let you guys know that this is another theory week, and the first 4 weeks are just hard. They're not easy, but that's going to set you up for so much success. So again, if after today you're feeling a little, I don't know, then just bear with me, ask questions, and I'm sure other people have those same questions. But this is going to give us a pretty big overview of a lot of stuff, which is going to set the stage for a lot of exercise selection and also a lot of positional drill considerations. So we're first going to appreciate what gait is, what it is, biomechanically what it does, what muscles are involved, joint actions, etc. Then we're going to understand asymmetry. We're going to get into some PRI stuff. Then we're going to get into the specifics of those PRI patterns, and then understand the difference between different visual foot types. So we're going to start to get into a little bit of an assessment right now, which we can do a lot more in the review session this upcoming Friday. But right now, all I want you guys to do is just understand the concepts. So this is the big boy, and this is the big concept that I think a lot of us are still trying to wrap our minds around, and that's totally okay because this is not an easy concept. So when it comes to pelvic movement, there's 2 main types. There is relative and absolute orientation. Absolute orientation, or just orientation, is the pelvis moving without any internal rotation of the innominate bones, external rotation of the innominate bones, counter nutation, nutation. That is just the pelvis moving as one unit like this. This is orientation right here. This is relative motion. So when there's relative motion, that is what we need to achieve certain orientations. Like if we want a proper posterior pelvic tilt, we probably want sacral counter nutation. If we want a proper anterior pelvic tilt, we probably need sacral nutation. Because we have normal lumbar lordosis of 30 degrees within our spine, we need some degree of that closed packed position like we were talking about earlier before this presentation started. That provides stability, but we still need counter nutation under certain contexts. And this is a relative action. Most people will compensate via orientations because they can't find what they're lacking through the relative motion, because if they could, then there would be no need to compensate. So if I don't have nutation, I'm going to dump forward into an anterior pelvic tilt because that's going to help me achieve internal rotation. If I'm someone who's stuck in nutation, I might squeeze my glutes really hard and pull my pelvis back in an orientation to help me pick up external rotation. Gait is primarily a pelvic on femoral action. Because the foot is fixated to the ground, this means that we are operating in a heavy closed chain environment. So gait is not this right here. Gait is this. Gait is the pelvis moving on and off of the femur, like so. We need to be able to go through all phases of these relative motions if we're going to go through the gait cycle. So a lot of people will talk about this concept of making exercises like gait. Like, what phase of gait is this split squat? What phase of gait is this deadlift or whatever? And I think people have gotten very deep into the weeds of saying that stuff literally, where it's not actually a literal thing. What we're trying to say is we're trying to get into a position which mimics the joint actions representative of a certain gait cycle to get the relative motion. It's not like we're literally mimicking mid stances. No, like we're just lining up the pelvis to get the positions of mid stance in this closed chain environment. Okay, so that was the basic concepts of gait. Let's get into what we're actually looking at here. So we know that when we are going from heel strike to toe off, we need to strike on the lateral border of our foot, and that needs to carry us onto the ball of the big toe, which will then allow us to push off. There needs to be this nice diagonal progression that happens. But due to this, we're not going to need to necessarily, let's say we struck the ground with our foot and we immediately started propelling in terms of like pushing off, we would not be able to yield. We would not be able to slow down that pelvis. Like, let's say this is the pelvis that's forward. We need to slow it down for the other side to advance forward. We need to yield, and this needs to come forward, that left pelvis in right stance. So the reason why we need to yield and the reason why there's so much eccentric activity is for that reason. So really, gait is a very eccentric dominant activity. There's not a lot of concentric activity in gait, which is interesting. In running, that changes, obviously. But in terms of just straight up heel strike, this concentric activity of the tib anterior, obliques, and hamstring is not that much compared to the eccentric activity slowing down. Think of all these muscles working on the back side right here to slow down the progression of the right pelvis and start to facilitate that left pelvis coming forward. So we're gonna move from here, slow down so the left side can get forward. In terms of the joint actions, look very carefully at that bottom right image right there. Look how it says pelvis, femur, tibia, IR, ER. Notice how after we push off at about, what was that, 70% of the gait cycle? We begin moving towards internal rotation. That does not mean we are in internal rotation. That means we are beginning to move towards it from a position of external rotation. So we are still externally rotated, but we are internally rotating. Because once we strike the ground, as you'll see, we need to create a strategy of internal rotation. So the sacrum is going to be counter-nutated. The pelvis is going to be in an externally rotated position. The femur relative to the tibia is going to be an IR more so, but it's still an ER. So just keep that in mind, that the femur is rotated inwards just a little bit more relative to the tibia, which is rotating out. Foot is supinated and the big toe is spread out. So to summarize, that's what this looks like right here. This is where we're going to be at. If we're imagining the left side as the leg that's forward right here, this is where we're going to be. Counter nutation on this side, more nutation on the back. But we're beginning to move towards nutation on that left side once we strike the ground. Because of the ground reaction force, it's just physics speaking right here. You can see in letter A right here what the foot forces are doing, and then it's like just the equal and opposite reaction, basic physics right here. This is just Newton, and they're in the posterior direction, which allows for the slowing and the yielding of the advancement of the other side to come forward. Because we need to create friction. to create that yielding. We need to create, so to speak, a propulsive strategy in terms of holding ourselves up as soon as we strike the ground. So imagine if you were to strike the ground with your heel and you didn't have any ability to create a propulsive strategy, you can't move towards internal rotation, you're just gonna collapse into the ground. So we need the ability to basically propel as soon as we hit the ground, but that is allowing us to stay upright and slow down for the other side to come forward. Notice how the vertical ground reaction forces, just in terms of the amount of weight being pushed into the ground, is pretty low once we first strike the ground, but it ramps up very quickly. That's because we're creating that propulsive strategy to allow ourselves to stay upright. So again, just to recap, look at how it says internally rotating, not internally rotated with an ED. What this is saying is that we are moving towards that internally rotated state before we strike the ground, which that allows us to do strike the ground, move towards this right here. All right, so let's recap that. I'm gonna be unsharing my screen so that we can visualize this together. So if my pelvis, let's do the left side is the stance leg right here. We're gonna be here more so in heel strike, but we're quickly moving towards this right here. So we're here, and then we're gonna begin to need to create that internal rotation moment. And then in late stance, we're gonna start moving away from it as well. So it goes ER, IR, ER. The first step is this yielding to slow this down to allow this to come forward. Do you guys ever want me to go through the pelvic model a couple of times? Like, let me know. I'm never sure how many reps is enough. In mid stance, this is going to be a little bit more concentric activity. So we're going to see the proximal fibers of the hamstring, which are responsible for hip extension, start to work here to secure that, because clearly we're in a position of relative hip extension than we were before. The anterior glute med is going to be working to create internal rotation, and the TFL is also going to be working here. It should work. A lot of people demonize the TFL as if it's like some muscle that's a compensatory rotator, which it is a lot of the time. So we also need that muscle to be working. The quads are going to be working to extend the knee. Now, what's interesting here is the adductors are actually eccentric, which I'm sure some people are like, why are the adductors eccentric when we are in mid stance, which is internal rotation? It's because of what I said with the Lemark model. Remember in the first week when I said at 90 degrees, the internal rotators have more leverage to become internal rotators? The adductors are the same way. So because they attach up in here primarily, they don't have leverage to create internal rotation. When this contracts, it actually has leverage to create external rotation. I'm not sure why it went like that. It has, they attach right here. So if this gets pulled down, that's what's going to happen right there. So they're acting eccentrically because the pelvis is going into relative internal rotation on the stance leg. Your adductors will work concentrically for internal rotation and adduction when you're in deeper levels of hip flexion. Now, let's take a peek right here. Around 20% of the gait cycle, this is peaked in terms of internal rotation. But notice how we're not even fully into mid stance yet. So once we bypass about 20%, we're going to start moving towards external rotation pretty rapidly. The sacrum is going to be nutated. Pelvis is in IR, femur is in IR, but ER relative to the tibia. Tibia is in IR, foot is pronated, and the big toe is beginning to move towards the second toe. This is going to be important, this big toe thing, when we start to look at feet. So think about the transition from ER to IR, and really, the amount of IR that's necessary for gait isn't a ton, because really, like, it's so externally rotation dominant. There's two phases of external rotation for a reason. We're moving towards internal rotation at points, but that doesn't mean like we're like really, you know, nutated. It's not like our pelvis ever looks like that. You know, it's very subtle from here to here. Now, if we look at the mid-stance ground reaction forces prior to peak mid-stance, around 10 to 15%, if you look right about here, this is where the vertical ground reaction forces are going to be very high. This allows us to basically put as much force into the ground, so the most propulsive part of gate is at about 10 to 15%, and just before, right here, just before 50%. So why is this? It's because we're creating the most friction. It's because we have the most leverage to push force into the ground and for force to be pushed back at us. And this is also why when people are walking on ice, to give you a visualization, they do these very shallow steps, right? Very short steps. It creates more friction and more mid-stance. You're biasing mid-stance when you do that. And this is just a recap of what I've said. Notice how we're moving towards external rotation again. Okay. So now let's visualize that again. So right here, we're in heel strike. We're going to move towards this internal rotation right here. Boom. And then in late stance, we're gonna start to move away from it again. But for exaggerated purposes, this right here is creating that eccentric orientation of the adductor. The femur is going to be biased into IR, but relative to the tibia, it's in less IR than the tibia. And then the foot's going to be pronating, because if you look at the foot model right here, striking lateral border of our heel, we're going to start to move towards this position where the foot is straight ahead, and this tibial internal rotation should be occurring to allow for this yielding action of the foot. When this foot yields onto the ground, when we're here with the flat arch, so to speak, that is stretching out the intrinsic foot musculature on the bottom of the foot. This is called the windlass mechanism. So when this occurs, this stretches out, which allows for that spring to occur for the arch to re-rise when we push off. Does that make sense? So it's like stretching, it's like creating elastic return of energy. That's what gait does to help us conserve energy, to help us be efficient when we move. Would you say those in a posterior pelvic tilt have better gait mechanics due to gait being heavily ER? That's hard to say. Usually people have a ton of ER can't pronate very well because they can't create that tibial internal rotation. So it's really hard to say. I can't say that like they do or don't, but that I could see how you could bring that point up for sure. Late stance, the glute max is going to be working concentrically, but in very low amounts, less than you might expect, because we're just using momentum, as I'll touch on a little bit more later. We're just basically falling and catching ourselves. But in this position right here, the adductor is going to work for hip extension, the intrinsic foot musculature. If you remember what I said about the windlass mechanism, it's going to re-spring back up. Foot's going to resupinate. And then all these muscles right here are going to be on stretch. But what does that do? It allows us to then spring. Let's say that psoas is being stretched out. That psoas is going to stretch, spring, and get that elastic return on energy to allow us to bring it into hip flexion. In terms of the mechanics right here, now the sacrum's more counternutated, pelvis is more ER, femur is more ER, but IR relative to the tibia. Tibia is in ER, foot supinated, now the big toe's hugging the second toe. All right, I'm gonna break all this down. So let's first start at the foot. So we've got this pronated foot, right? Tibial's an internal rotation. We're going to have to externally rotate the tibia. And then these toes are going to move inwards like this as you push back off. This is more mid stance. This is more late stance. So that windlass mechanism is working to respring the foot, which creates the weight being pushed more onto the toes. Now, within my pelvis, I need to move. I'm still moving back towards an externally rotated state. So I was here in mid stance, I'm going to start to go back here into counter nutation. Okay, so let's think about the psoas now, because I think this is an important consideration for how swing works. If I'm walking right here, psoas, and then I push off right here, I have my hip extension. This muscle is stretched, so I'm going to basically spring it through to here. And then I can go here. Now this psoas is on stretch to here. Does that make sense? So that's why our psoas is really important. It gets demonized a lot, but it's, if you want to swing your foot, it's going to be really, really important. Is being flat-footed a compensatory strategy? Not necessarily. I think genetics play into it quite a bit. In fact, a lot bit. But I also think that I think you can have a compensatory flat foot presentation. Who demonizes the psoas? A lot of people in the foam rolling world, I think, in the self-myofascial release. Okay, so if you guys have any questions on that so far, please let me know, because this is an important concept to understand, the mechanics, especially this right here. This kind of stuff is really important. So if you
Hey,
have
Connor?
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. If you can go down, so you're saying, say just for instance, these late stands, femur ER, but relative to the tibia is an IR. And then you go down to, say, go down like subtalar joint or like calcaneus. What's happening there relative to an ER tibia?
Sure. So if you go all the way down, then that tibial external rotation right here, this is what's happening right there. You see how it's going to allow for the resupination effect right here. So the calcaneus is going to be in relatively more inversion, like so. And then that's going to feed into creating more rigidity within the arch, because supination is rigidity and pronation is yielding. If you think about pushing off within our foot, I like to think of late stance as more concentric external rotation and early stance as more eccentric external rotation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Would there be a segment, so the calcaneus is inverting? Is there a segment that's that would be everting in that late stance, or is everything kind of just resupinating?
That's a really good question. So yeah, it's a relative motion, right? So pronation is really the rear foot going into eversion, forefoot going into inversion. The opposite is true within supination. You're seeing the rear foot go into inversion and the forefoot going into eversion. Let me see if I can, yeah, kind of like that.
And the same thing would be happening, but more in like a yielding capacity and heel strike.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good question. That was really nice. Any other questions? All right. So in late stance now, the ground reaction forces are directed anteriorly with the foot applying posteriorly directed force. So essentially what I want you guys to think about is the biggest transition, like the most force we put into the ground is when we are at that 10 to 15%, but also when we are pushing off, right? So that's going to be a lot of force being directed posteriorly, which leads to the opposite ground reaction forces because of the equal and opposite force direction principle from just physics. So if you were to go to running and increase your stride length, then you would just be increasing these anterior to posterior ground reaction forces, which leads to overall increases in sagittal plane joint torques, as we'll see in a second. So like I mentioned, late stance is more concentric external rotation, which allows for propulsion and necessary resupination of the ankle. And I think I already kind of took you guys through the practical application of things there. But if we can do a ton more of this stuff after the presentation is over, unless you guys have any additional questions right now. No? Okay. Swing, I don't get into swing too much because like I'm a closed chain exercise a lot of the times type of person. So if you want the specifics on that, there's technically 3 phases of swing: toe off, mid swing, and terminal swing. The psoas is going to be working here along with the tibia anterior because of this dorsiflexion moment right here. And then the hamstrings and quads are going to be working eccentrically here. And then you see that and we're moving towards this internally rotated position, but we're still in a place of external rotation. One thing that, before I get to this, one thing that I've been discussing, in fact, yeah, we can go to this slide. I made that post yesterday. I don't know if anyone saw it, but it's the idea of hip extension and late stance leading to trunk rotation and also arm swing. When we look at gait later and we look at people walk or run, arm swing is a huge indicator of what this person is capable of doing. Because as I mentioned, gait is just falling. Look at how we're alternating between potential and kinetic energy. At the top of that hill, that bike has a lot of potential. This is kinetic, back up to potential. So essentially what's going on here is that this person is just catching themselves and they have a lot of kinetic energy. And then as they transition to more momentum, they pick up more potential energy. So let's think about it like this. If I'm gonna be walking right here, then I'm gonna take a step forward with, let's go left foot, like here. This extension of the hip needs to happen. I need to be able to resupinate and toe off for me to turn my trunk into this right here. And then that's going to allow me to stretch out my psoas, bring this through to here. And then I'm gonna get a nice arm swing if I can get hip extension. If I don't get hip extension on this back leg, I'm gonna pick up my heel too early. I'm not gonna be able to actually turn, and then my gait's gonna look really short. I'm gonna be lifting up my feet way too early, and I'm not gonna be getting the elastic return on energy of the foot, of so many muscles that are involved within late stance. So another reason why hip extension is really important. So
Is that, sorry,
go ahead.
is that caused by a lack of rotation or by a problem in on the foot or on the ankle?
It's hard to say without the proper assessment context, but I would say that this is one possible explanation. This is not the end all be all, but if we're here, this is probably more of a hip and pelvis issue of lacking hip extension. Then, like potentially there could be some stuff going on with the foot, and I'm sure there is, but I think in this context is a top-down issue. What's going on with people that drag their feet when walking? So we're probably talking about this right here. People that just do this. I would imagine those people have a very similar problem where they're not getting the stretch on the psoas, they're not getting here, so they're not able to actually create that right there. They're really just maybe lifting up too early, dragging, and using a concentric strategy of their hip flexors. And it could just be weakness, honestly. But those people usually don't have hip extension. They have a lot of other things going on as well. Can you explain the relationship between the femur and tibia at late stance, please? Yes. Okay. So the femur is in IR relative to the tibia. I don't want you guys to get too hung up on that. That just means it's in less ER. But if we are in push off, then think about what the pelvis needs to do. The pelvis is going to be in hip extension, counter nutation, and it's going to be like this. The femur is going to be in the back like that. So that's an externally rotated position of my hip. That's going to be like this. The femur is going to come out into ER and hip extension. You're not going to have IR and hip extension. You're going to have ER and hip extension, but you're moving in terms of the pelvis, mid-stance, transition back to counter nutation. The tibia is going to be in more ER because of that supination of the foot and that torque that occurs, like as we push off. The tibia really needs to go into quite a good bit of ER because the foot is also behind the body. And it's gonna be really hard for you to IR that tibia with your foot behind the body. You're gonna be in more ER, which allows you to then create rigidity here. Like to internally rotate my tibia here would be really hard. So this is a lot of relative tibial ER. And then here I've got a rigid foot. I can strike the ground with a more rigid foot for it to pronate again. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to hit with that. You can also think about it like the more a knee is extended, the more knee is locked out, you're getting more tibial external rotation and more relative femoral internal rotation. The more the knee is flexed, you have more femoral external rotation with tibial internal rotation. So someone with a lack of hip extension and foot pronation might be more likely to walk with the feet pointed out. Yeah. Yeah. More likely, not for sure, but like potentially, yes. Walking and running are obviously a little bit different. When we run, that's technically more muscularly driven, but it's a lot of isometric contractions. That's how I'm kind of looking at running at this point. I used to think it was very like eccentric, concentric in nature. I think now it's more of like just a series of different isometric contractions. That's a different story for a different day. Just in terms of this right here, we do know that it is objectively more muscularly driven. We do know you're going to see more action occurring here. Stance phase is going to begin on more of the forefoot to utilize the elastic energy in the tendon. So think about what I said when the foot is 10 to 15% of the gait cycle, the ground reaction forces, right here. Let's look at this. We're not going to want to strike on our heel when we run because that's not going to allow us to maximize the ground reaction forces to help create elastic return on energy, and that stiffness, those co-contractions that need to happen when we run, especially at a higher velocity. We want to be on relatively more of our forefoot so we can start the gait cycle here, and then we can push off right after that. So that's why people strike the ground on more of their forefoot when they run, or at least they probably should. If you're slapping the ground with your heel when you run, there's probably something else going on there. Like I mentioned earlier, there's an increase in sagittal plane torques. So if you're a runner, you need this hip extension. You need to be able to get all of these joint actions at a higher degree, because if you don't, you're going to find a way to make it happen. So especially looking at extension, like look at how much greater these are at running than walking. So this is just one EMG look at running and walking. But ultimately, we do need more concentric action. But remember, there's a lot of isometric actions happening here. If we think about the stiffness that needs to happen when we strike the ground at a high velocity, our calf, our quad, our glute, hamstring, they need to be firing to create that isometric contraction so we can get that elastic return on energy and we can be efficient when we run. If we didn't, we would not be efficient and our mile times would not be very good. Most common case you see for a heel spur, Marcus, let's get to that at the end. And actually, Marcus, I'll talk about that when we talk about feet. Did you hit on someone who has zero heel strike within their gait? I was making food. We can talk about that when we talk about feet too. Yeah. Oh, we're here. Okay. So now that we've got an idea of what the specific joint actions are within the gait cycle, we can now think about when we visually look at people's feet, how that manifests itself in a visual posture. So two things here. First and foremost, my friend, Alex Effer taught me this. So this is not my information. This is actually something I learned from him. I'm going to say his name a lot because I really respect the guy and I think he has a lot of good stuff. Secondly, when it comes to this whole idea, this is like a visual, this is not biomechanical objective assessment. This is a little bit subjective in nature. In week 5, if you guys look at the calendar, we're going to have a visual posture session that's totally free, like open for you guys to attend. We're just going to take some coaches and look at this. We're going to take some coaches and look at how this lines up with a lot of other things we're seeing within our objective assessment process, which I think is really important. So right here, we've got a foot that's stuck in heel strike. This is a representation of the joint actions that are happening in heel strike, right? So we would expect to see if someone is biased towards external rotation, This is a narrow ISA, primary compensation. High arch, distal femoral internal rotation, but you're probably going to see ER everywhere, honestly. Tibia is an ER, more so than the femur. Arch is high, big toe is in external rotation, and you see this toe gap. This toe gap is massively, it's just such a big indicator, because remember, when we strike the ground, our foot is spread between our big and second toe, first and second met head. So if you see this, which you do frequently, this is an indication this person's biased towards early stance of gait. They probably can't pronate very well. They probably are lacking internal rotation. They can't create a propulsive strategy as well. And we're gonna get a ton of reps looking at people like this. This is just the beginning. Mid stance, this is me actually on the right here. I am a wide and I'm biased towards mid stance. So you can see that the femur is more externally rotated, but the tibia is more internally rotated. The arch is gonna be somewhere around average to low. The big toe is mostly straight ahead. And the little toe is gonna be an internal rotation as well. Do you see that? Look at my little toes right there. I think that's a pretty strong indication of what's going on right there. So this person is what you would expect from a primary wide with no additional compensations. We on the same page so far? People ask me all the time, what am I looking at? And I know this question is going to come up. What am I looking at when I say the tibia is in external rotation or internal rotation in the femur too? Yeah, I see some people nodding their heads. Yeah, this is for sure something we want to think about. So I'm going to look at the insertion of the tibia bone and the distal portion of the femur. So let's see if, yeah, I think this is probably a better. So if I were to draw a line from the plateau, this is the patella right here. If I were to draw a line from the tibia outwards, where would this go? No, it'd go out this way. If I were to draw a line here, where would it go? Out this way. If I were to draw a line down here into the femur, where is it going? This way. Same thing here. So look at how, though, actually we'll get into that with late stance, but just understand that that's what I'm looking at right there. Late stance is now representative of these joint actions. You ever see people with bunions? That's what this is. A foot that is being stuck in this position right here. Late stance, all their weight is on their foot. Or, of course it is. All their weight is on their big toes, so they turn out this way. And then that's representative of what happens when we push off and resupinate. So if you see a distal femur that's in internal rotation, you can also see ER2 here. That's why it's like one or the other. Tibia is in external rotation for sure, with the arch being mid to low, the big toes in ER, or you have a big toe gap. What if you have this person right here? This person still has a semblance of an arch underneath their left foot, kind of. So if you see someone who is, and this is almost always a narrow infrasternal angle, who has a big toe gap, but their toes are facing outwards like this bunion picture right here, like this, that person has bypassed mid-stance because they can't find mid-stance. So what's their way to find a propulsive strategy? Anterior pelvic tilt, weight goes forward on the toes go out, and now you can see it visually. This right here is very common, this image right here. Hip internal rotation, anterior pelvic orientation, adduction of the knees, tibial ER, and ankle pronation. You guys see a bunch of people with knocked knees, people that have knees that go inwards, like that knee valgus chronically all the time. That's what's going on right here. Hip IR, femoral IR, tibial ER. We on the same page so far? I know this is we're gonna get so many reps with this, guys. Don't sweat it at all. Don't sweat it at all.
Hey, Connor.
So many reps.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry. I just have a quick question on, in general, do you analyze this from the ground up or from top down, considering pelvis and the foot?
Can you clarify? I think I had a hard time hearing the first part of
Yeah, sure. So would you first take a look at the foot and the tibia, or like at the pelvis? Because I find it hard to like figure out what to consider first.
Always,
No.
always, unless there's something significant going on with the foot, like they had 10 ankle sprains on that foot, think about proximal before distal. That'll make your life so much easier. This is how it goes usually. If it's not a proximal issue, like you take care of the pelvis and rib cage, all of our assessments from week 4 check out pretty well, and they still have issues, then it's a foot issue. Then look at the foot and start to do foot specific things. If that doesn't do it, then it's a cranial issue. You're gonna have auditory, visual, position of the joints and bones here, and potentially dental considerations. That's the progression I use. But the thing is with all these exercises that we're going to be talking about, they all have a foot and a pelvic reference and a rib cage reference. So all this stuff is being taken care of anyway. It's just that if you don't get all the way there with someone, then start to think about more isolated foot stuff. That's when I'll break out the Gary Ward wedges. That's when I'll break out some really like trying to drive tibial IR or something like that.
All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Can you show toe ER, IR on the model? Yeah, so toes are just, think about IR as rotating towards the midline of the body. Think of ER as rotating away from the midline of the body. So if I had internal rotation of the toe, it would probably look like this. External rotation of the toe might be like that. IR of the little toe, ER of the little toe. IR, ER. Can you show what's going on with the sacrum? Okay, so in terms of what? Like I guess I would need to know like what in particular. Late stance, sure. Yeah, so here we go. We go early stance, mid stance, late stance. We're beginning to move back towards external rotation. Early stance, mid stance, late stance. What if only one foot is in late stance? You see this all the time. And what's going on there is that you have an asymmetrical foot arch presentation. This is basically saying that whatever foot arch is higher, they're pushing into that side. Imagine what would happen if you were to have a hip hike on the right side. What would happen? My right hip would be here. I'd be doing this. So I'd be on more the outside of my ankle. Here I'd be more pronated on my left one. The opposite would be true for this. So whatever side is pronated, they're probably pushing and they're in a later stage of gait on that side. In the context of this guy right here, we can tell that he's collapsing that ankle in to push himself over, and that left big toe is not even on the ground really. So it's probably pushing from the right to the left here. If one is in more late staging gait, even if it's like mid stance and heel strike, then that mid stance foot is pushing more into the other side. All right. Now with that out of the way, let's get into some asymmetry. So I don't know how familiar anyone is here with PRI concepts, but this is obviously all about PRI. This is obviously, I've taken a lot of PRI courses, and I'm going to try and simplify a lot of it. But if you want more information, obviously take some of their courses. I highly recommend them. And especially this course sets you up so well to understand a lot of their primary courses. So in terms of what makes us asymmetrical in the first place, if you look at this image right here, I think if you were to study it, then you can see how the right side of the brain is a little bit more of what makes us human. The left side of the brain is a little bit more like, a lot of animals can do some form of analysis and calculation. Like they can change their speed and they can like meet an animal or prey at a certain angle. Whereas like timing sequencing too, that would also go into it. Whereas the right side of the brain is more creativity, context, and perception. We're the only animals that can put context into our language necessarily, like in terms of thinking of the past and the future and referencing it to a present moment. So now if we think about this left side of the brain, which controls the right side of the body, because we have better dexterity, timing and sequencing on the right side of our body, you'd think that more people would probably be more right-handed, right? That's exactly what we see. So this is inherently what makes us asymmetric. In terms of our organs, we also have more stuff packed on the right side. If I were to cut myself down the middle like Hannibal and put myself on a scale, my right side would weigh slightly more than my left. So gravitationally speaking, we're also biased towards the right side. The liver is a massive organ that's on the right side. More diaphragm on the right side. More lung on the right. So the diaphragm now, we get into this much more next week, but just to touch on it, the right dome is bigger than the left. We know this. And if you look at any anatomy textbook, you'll see it time and time again. The right crura, that thick, meaty attachment, has two attachments that are pretty thick, really 3. But the left crura is the string. It's just like there's nothing there, right? It's just holding on a little bit. So the right dome has more leverage on the anterior spine, which allows for it, if we were to brace and use that diaphragm as a muscle of stabilization, that could pull us into the right side more when we're doing something like a squat. The left diaphragm doesn't have anything blocking it. It's got like that, it doesn't have that liver, which the right diaphragm sits on top of. So the left diaphragm can descend and it can stay descended. More so than the right because of that liver. This is our friend Neil right here. This is a really good image that illustrates the normal human orientation, the left AIC, the right BC pattern. And this is just because the body is concerned with survival. Next time it's socially acceptable for you guys to be in a social circle, you know, like when you're all just chatting, hanging around, look at how people stand. Look at how people will hug their right sides. Look at what happens when someone starts to feel a little bit awkward, when someone starts to get a little bit uncomfortable, what their mannerisms are with how they hold themselves. Look at speakers present. You can't see me, but most of the time I'm on my right side and I don't even realize it because it's just comfortable there. Try to hold a conversation with someone with your left foot back, right foot in front, leaning on your left hip. I don't know about you, but for me, that feels more awkward than if I'm back here. Just something to look at. So this right here is a PRI concept, the left anterior chain. And this is just muscles that have I don't even care if you really know this slide that much. I'm just trying to give PRI the credit that they obviously deserve for this and using their language to help you understand it. But basically, it's a chain of muscles that runs down. And what's a little bit confusing is the left AIC is actually representative of right stance, whereas the right AIC is representative of left stance. So when you think left AIC, think the left AIC is representative of a body that's stuck in pelvic right stance. Now within the pelvis itself, wow, we've seen these things coupled together before, haven't we? The ilium, that's an extension, adduction, internal rotation on the right side. The left is inflection, abduction, and external rotation. But the right side is posteriorly tipped, whereas the left is anteriorly tipped. Now here's the thing. A lot of people that haven't taken PRI courses a lot will think the right femur is in internal rotation and the left is in external rotation. That would make sense, right? The right femur is in external rotation and the left femur is in internal rotation. But that almost doesn't make a difference. Sorry, my mouth is really dry. That almost doesn't make a difference because the pelvis is going to be in control of what happens to the femur. So think about it like this, and this is usually a point of confusion for some people. Remember, anterior orientation equals femur in internal rotation. Posterior orientation equals femur in external rotation. But here's the thing. Because the right side is higher like this, the right femur is also adducted. It also goes down like this, whereas the left one is more abducted. So it's like this, but also out like that more, because of this asymmetrical pelvis right here. So I know that's confusing, but don't even worry, because if you can get the right side to push back over to the left, then this will take care of itself. These femurs will take care of themselves. Worry about this. Worry about the fact that the right pelvis is biased towards compression, left towards expansion. If you got that, then you're great. You'll probably not have to think about the femurs. And then you can correct this, and then everything's great. Does anyone have a question on that?
Yeah, Connor. So that's what they call a left AIC?
Correct.
Hey, Connor, I have a question.
Sure.
So I myself, I believe I am a left AIC pattern. And when I have my left femur externally rotated, I'm very comfortable. But as soon as I try to bring it in any position, exercise or whatever, it feels really awkward. And just based on what you just described right now, it sounds very counterintuitive to be what you describe internally rotated versus externally rotated, because I also cannot pronate very well, or if at all, on the left.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, but still I run a lot of marathons and I just started deadlifting and squatting.
There's
So
your
things
answer.
have gotten better, but I still have some issues. So again, just to go back, the internal rotation is, to me, is like I see myself sleeping, walking, exercising. It seems like my left is actually externally rotated. But based on what you just said, it sounds like probably not.
Probably, I don't know. Well, you could have an additional compensation because you run marathons. I think you probably almost certainly have a secondary compensation. So if you run marathons, I'm going to assume that you're narrow. But I don't know. Let me see. Where are you at?
Give me a second.
Oh, you don't have to turn your camera on. Let me ask you: Are you narrow or wide? Do you think?
I think I can show you this. Okay, so hopefully you can see me well right now. Give me a second.
This will help us understand a little bit more.
Just not in a great place to actually show my entire body, but let's do my best. That's as much as I can show you right now.
Yeah, you look like you could be narrow. Most people are, so I usually prefer to that. So if you're narrow, you're probably in ER bias originally. Now the left side, you can be a narrow external angle with the left pelvis forward. Now the left is in relatively more IR, or you have a different compensatory strategy. I would have no idea unless I assessed you, but I would assume to give you the best answer I can right now, you have secondary compensations and you have some degree of a restriction, because usually, let me pin myself. If you were to test the left femur, just like in like a seated femoral internal rotation or whatever, because of the position of it, it's going to impinge if you rotate it in. It's going to impinge because of this forward pelvic position right here. It's going to impinge on the rim of the acetabulum. Similar to if you were to bring this right side right here, which is higher, and do hip flexion, it's going to get blocked on this rim of the acetabulum. Whereas the left side doesn't really have that as much because this is internally rotated, but it's also abducted out like this. So it can.
Okay. That's exactly what I experienced. Yep. Yep. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
That makes sense.
Don't mind my disgusting editing a lot of videos, a lot of Adobe files there. So this is what you usually see. The right side is biased towards more heel strike and mid stance because remember, the right side is biased towards pelvic IR, but also that's like, I kind of think of that as like heel strike mid stance-ish, but the foot is supinated. So you're gonna see a higher arch relative femoral IR relative. Really, that actually, I should say ER. That's a typo right there. I was like, why am I saying that? Like, that is better right there. So just femoral ER, higher arch. Big toe gap is often larger on the right than the left. Usually, even if there's no big toe gap, the left big toe still tends to hug the second toe more because the left is in mid stance. We're pushing to the right. So that's going to be lower arch, big toe is often hugging the second toe. In terms of the musculature associated with this, the right side has relatively more concentrically oriented adductors, anterior gluteus medius, obliques, and medial hamstrings. Now, this is all relative. you know? So this is not something that's, you know, like if you're narrow or wide, it's going to depend. It's going to depend. But if you're a wide and you already had more leverage with your adductors, you're probably going to have even more on your right side. Left side has more concentrically oriented glute max, posterior gluteus medius, which is more of an external rotator and hip abductor and hip flexors because of that anterior orientation of the pelvis. This is just secondary to skeletal position because muscular function is secondary to that and orientation. But it's easy because whatever the right side has, the left side needs, and whatever the left side has, the right side needs. So we can just basically fill in the gaps of what phases of gait they're missing, and then you're all good. I wish it was that easy. So this is man, I'm so tempted in this gym to buy force plates, but they're like $5,000, which is just repulsively expensive. So I don't know, but I used to be able to use one all the time. This wasn't really like a force plate, more of like a body weight track or whatever. It's called the Body Track. Right here on the left, we've got a track athlete, great athlete I worked with. And with her, she had this eighth, she's not even in a quarter squat right now. She's in an eighth squat. And she knows to stay stacked. She knows, like I've worked with her for a couple of weeks. She knows what she's doing to some extent. But even here, she's got 84% of her weight in her right heel and 15% on her right forefoot. Left side has 20% on the forefoot, but she's got 67% of her weight on her right side, just in this position, which is crazy. This guy right here, older gentleman, I think he's around 65. He's totally on his toes, super extended, anterior pelvic tilt pushing him onto his toes, but he still has 60% of his weight on his right side. This right here is a volleyball player on the right. And I just told her to get in a normal neutral stance. Don't even think about it. Just do whatever you think is normal and natural and do an overhead squat. And then this is what I saw. I picked an overhead squat because she's gonna have to self-organize into whatever she can to get there. I actually don't like the overhead squat that much, but I think that this is gonna challenge her. So I just wanted to see what happened. And her normal stance is the left foot ahead of the right. That was most conducive to her being successful at this task. With 90% of her weight on her right heel and 58% of her weight on her left forefoot. This is picture perfect right here. So if you guys ever can get one of these at the place you work at, this is really good for getting buy-in and also just like seeing objective progress. So what? So the right side is better at accepting more weight and being strong and loading, causing a weight shift usually to the right side in a bilateral lower body exercise because we can get in our right side easier. The left pelvis is better at pushing off, causing more people to prefer jumping off of that side. I polled Twitter and I was like, how many of you prefer to jump off your left foot? No other context was given. 52% of people out of like 1,000 something responses said the left hip. And I think that's because a couple of reasons. One, this, but that's not the only reason. I think also when people were growing up and they did like a right-handed layup, they jump off their left foot. Maybe they were taught that in basketball camp, so it carries over. But I think that this is a massive consideration. So the right side needs more expansion in the pelvis. Left side needs more compression and mid stance. Okay, let's answer some exercises really quick, or answer some questions. Is it a stupid idea to train hip flexion if you're stuck in APT? No, I do not think so. I think hip flexors are not the enemy. Go read my post on Instagram, hip flexors are not the enemy. It was like 2 months ago. That describes my thoughts really well on it. But basically, if you want to train a muscle, you want to take it through a full range of motion, right? Or for the most part, that would be nice to leverage that. The stretch to contract principle a muscle needs to go through. So if you were to, I bet if people were to train their hip flexors, they would probably see an improvement within their posture and movement more. Because just because a muscle is short and tight does not mean it is strong. I bet most people have weak hip flexors, actually. But I would definitely prioritize driving hip extension for sure. Is this why I have more balance on a single leg deadlift on my left than right? Yes. What is the name of that mat? It's Body Track. I'll type it in the chat right here. or it's actually, it might be body track like that. It's one of those two. Oh, Nathan's on it. He knows what's up. For the right AIC, is the opposite true from the previous slide? Yes, but very, very, very few people are truly right AICs. If you see someone who presents as a right AIC, I bet you they're in pelvic orientation. We cover that in week 5. That's almost always the case. If someone is truly a right AIC, that is one of two things. One, a massive compensation where their sacrum faces left, and or their organs were actually born, they were born, their organs flipped, which is like a very small percentage of the population, but unfortunately those people don't live that long anyway. But yeah, this asymmetry underlies all of us. That's what's beautiful about it. It makes it so much easier for us because we understand how they got to where they were. Go ahead, Max. Doge can pay for, honestly, that's what I'm banking on. Yeah, I'm banking on Dogecoin to take me to the forced plate affordability level.
Yeah, quick question, man. So I'm having like trouble like reconciling like why is you know, you're saying in a left AIC, you're saying that the right femur is externally rotated. It seems like you've got an ilia that is, the acetabulum is anteverted, which would lead to better femoral internal rotation.
Yes.
Am I not seeing that right?
No, I totally understand. I'm glad we're spending more time on this because this is a point of, because under normal circumstances, right? The pelvis, this should lead to more internal rotation, right? And then this should lead to more external rotation. But now we're throwing in the position of an asymmetrical sacrum. So the sacrum, if it tips forward on the left, it has to tip back on the right. There's no way you can have anything else really. So because of this, now you've got a pelvis where you're technically an ER on the left side, but now it's forward. And now this left femur goes inwards because of the orientation. And the right side, because it's posteriorly oriented, you're going to see a relative ER, but this is the thing. And this is why people say the right hip, the right femur's IR, it's not, it's an ER, but it's adducted. So it falls down like this. And then this one kind of abducts out like that. So you're kind of here.
Okay, so now say this person does a squat, okay? Are you gonna see them shift left or right?
Most people are gonna shift right in a squat. And you're gonna see the pelvis do something like this. It's gonna go here. And then this knee goes into the midline right here. That's because that femur is leveraged towards adduction, the left one towards abduction. But they're still doing this. And especially like, when does a hip shift happen, right? Sticking point of a squat. Sticking point of a squat, internal rotation of the pelvis, right side has more.
Is this because we've got too much concentric activity in lower glute max on the left that turns the sacrum that much, where you only have posterior expansion on the right? Is that what's happening when you get to that sticking point? Or
I think it's multifactorial in terms of like,
okay.
I think the glute max is a big player, but remember, it's the skeletal position. It's the diaphragm, the bracing, like all this other stuff that's driving us to be on our right hip in the first place. It's like all those things, but the glute max pushing to the right certainly is a player.
Okay, and then in terms of the adductors being eccentric in that mid stance, how, like, so say you, like, when you're putting someone and you say it changes as, you know, you descend during different levels of the squat. Now, like normally, like say like you're in hook line and you're trying to restore some internal rotation, right? You might put a towel or yoga block between someone's knees to help open up a narrow pelvic outlet, right?
Right.
Are you trying to recruit some adductors in that situation to achieve that, or that's another thing. I'm just having trouble with, like, why isn't adductors working concentrically in mid stance, you know?
For sure. So let's break that down. So let's answer the ball between the knees or yoga block between the knees scenario first. Remember, Limart model's 60 degrees. Most hook line position are around, oh gosh, I don't know, like 64, 50, something like that degrees. So placing a ball between the knees does help open the pelvic outlet to promote a little bit more IR. If you squeeze it more, then you're going to get this happening more. But if you were to stand up straight and squeeze a ball, you would probably not be doing that as much, because when you go into a hip shift, like you try to do this, really you're doing this. You're doing that. When I am here and I'm doing a hip shift, really I'm doing that. I'm doing that. Unless I get down into deeper levels of hip flexion, then I start to do this in a hip shift. Because that's when the internal rotators pick up leverage to move the pelvis, and that degree of hip flexion is also lined up to where we are biased towards IR. So when we're in gait, we're not in that much hip flexion. So when we're going through mid stance like this, our pelvis, is going to be rotated towards this side when we're here, but the adductor in that position has leverage to do this. So it's going to be eccentric when we're here.
In mid stance, what does the pelvis look like?
Of normal gait, like that. This is the stance leg.
Okay, and you're saying that adductors aren't going to be, they're going to be in more of an eccentric state there because, can you give me that one more time?
Yes, because your adductors have leverage to create, really, like they're not really working that much at all in gait, to be honest.
Yeah,
but they have leverage to pull down right here and create this.
Okay.
Unless you're in deeper levels of hip flexion, then the line of pull changes and they can do that.
Okay. All right, cool. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah, good questions. I think we got a lot of questions now, so let's see what we got. Odd question, but if someone is in this position and they reach towards the right with their trunk, is it odd to then feel pain in the left glute sacral area? I'm not sure what you mean by that, Julia, in terms of like visualizing that. Maybe if you want to unmute yourself and show us.
Yeah. So sorry, there's like boxes everywhere. So if you're in that left AIC pattern, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then if you were to reach this way, would it be odd to kind of feel like a sling pain in your glute?
Like if you're reaching right here?
Yeah.
Yeah, that could be playing into some fascial slings, but most people don't have right trunk rotation very much. So you could be extending through your low back to get that. You know what I mean? It's like because of, let me pin myself here. Because of this position where we're hugging our right side and the torso counter rotates back to the left, we don't have the ability to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So most people, when they go to the right with trunk rotation, will just extend their low back on the left to make that happen.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. That's just one possible explanation. In case of low back pain in a squat, can you use the Lemmark model to detect which phase of gait they need to get out of, or depends? It totally depends on the assessment for sure, but I will use the Lemmark model to select exercises to help promote what I want. I have a femur and tibia internally rotating. I'm pronated on my right foot. My adductor is horrible. Do you mean horrible as in like chronically tight, or is it just like painful? You can put that in the chat, Jessica, or you can unmute.
Sorry, I'm driving. Yeah, it's just, I actually even feel it when I'm driving, like I want to pull it out to the right. Does that make sense? It's just like tight and horrible.
It's just like really tight.
Yeah.
Yeah, I bet it's too tight. I bet you probably want that adductor to work in a different context. You probably want to recapture some ER on that right side. You're probably biased towards pelvic IR. And that adductor is just tight in standing, probably because it's stretched. You're taking a short muscle, putting a big stretch on it. So it feels like it needs to pull you over to the right. And when you're seated, it has a lot of leverage like you are right now to pick up and pull you to the right in internal rotation. So that's probably what you're feeling.
Yeah, I had right gluteal tendinopathy on that side. So my, I think that's linked, isn't it?
I'd say so, yeah. Yeah, we can keep using you as a case study like we did in the beginner program. That'll be good. Jamil asks, how much can a foot stance change and any changes with AIC and ACL tear? end up you having less rotation in the tibia. Yeah, with an ACL tear, you gotta learn, you gotta just basically restore movement options and get that person to trust that side. It really does depend for me, like what side are they, did that ACL happen on? If it's on the left side, they're gonna be the right hip a ton more. If they tore their right side, they're gonna find probably a compensatory action to get over to the left because they weren't very good there to begin with. So they'll probably end up with like a pelvic orientation that we'll talk about in week 5. Because we are right side dominant, it is possible that one side is shorter as well, and we place more weight on the left side when standing. So with this, if you're placing more weight on the left side and standing, you've got a secondary compensation of some form. But because the right hip is higher, the right hip tends to be longer, or the right femur appears longer, and the left femur is shorter. That's what people think. Like the left leg is short, right leg is long. It's not really the case. It's just the pelvic position. That's the case in most leg length discrepancy type of situations. I guess you will go on about this, but in the exercise selection, can you ever go wrong with a 90-90 hip lift with hip shifting on the left and unilateral reaching with the right arm? Currently, I almost always do this in the warm-up. I don't know if that like wrong is the right word or the word I would use, but I would say there's probably better options for some people. But yeah, that's like, most people will benefit from that, but it might not be the right time for them. Some people will actually not benefit from this nearly as much as others. And I try not to put someone in 90 degrees hip flexion if they can't pass it on a table. So why would I put someone, jam them into a range of motion they don't have if they don't have it to begin with? You know what I mean? Like why? So if I tested hip flexion, it was 80 degrees, I'm not going to put them in a 90-90 hip lift until they get that back. So doing that can just get them to not feel the right things. So if you've ever tried a 90-90 hip lift with someone and it doesn't go well, they can't feel their hamstrings, things feel weird, I bet you that's the case. Is this why I feel more stretch in a Bulgarian split squat on my right side when the right is elevated? Because the abduction of the right femur? Yeah, it depends where you feel that, Nicholas. I'd be curious what part of your body you feel that in.
Yeah, so it's all the way down from like where the joints meet, all the way down to more towards sort of my pelvis rather than down to my knee, and more down the middle, more down the middle.
What muscle would you say?
Quad.
On your right, you feel that when your right foot is back on the thing?
So think of it as going deep and my knee going backwards as well, the elevated knee.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And I feel that stretch a lot more intense than on my left when my left does that.
Yeah, that's hard to say without assessing you, you know what I mean? But keep that in mind for when we do go through assessments. I'd be happy to take a look at you, but you're probably missing hip extension on that right side, which is required. You need to be able to do this to get into that position. So that is just really the left AIC positioning right there. But if you don't have hip extension because you're forward on both sides, you might have something you might have a pelvic orientation. You might have, it's hard to say without assessing you. I wish I could answer that better. I already answered that. I'll check out those my golf thing. Thank you, Nathan. Are you likely to see a right knee valgus on a single leg squat due to the femur being an ER and is looking for propulsion through IR? Yeah, you can. That's one possible explanation for sure. Just depends. You can see a left one because you're trying to find pelvic IR and then you don't have that, so your knee goes in. I'll get to the rest of these questions. Let's get through these exercises because I want to have time for these. So this right here, these are just like basic PRI drills, right? So this is the 90-90 alternating crossover. What this is doing specifically on this side is I'm getting hamstring on the left. I'm getting medial hamstring so that I can get the internal rotation part of my hamstrings to work. And also my right quad is extended right here, extending my knee. So I'm getting right rectus femoris, which is helping me basically pull that right hip forward and pull the left back, reaching for right trunk rotation. I'm going through the same exact breathing as we were doing before that we talked about on last Monday. This right here is the left adductor pullback. This is a very standard PRI drill. Again, if they don't have 90 degrees of hip flexion, I might not put them here right away in some cases. But what this is doing is this is promoting a lot of internal rotation fibers of my adductor, getting my oblique to work, and also a little bit of hamstring pulling back. So I'm getting that mid stance joint action of the pelvis. I'm creating that outlet opening on the left. And I'm really making sure that I'm keeping these left abs on as I inhale, because that is going to allow me to expand my right side, which is facing the ground. Gravity's pushing down to allow me to get that right side thorax expansion. This right here is the side lying. This is the knee. We call it the knee to knee, but this is really the right glute max activity. You don't have to add the leg lift, but this exercise, I want you guys to know how to coach and execute extremely effectively, because I think, honestly, it's the most poorly coached PRI drill that I know of. A lot of people just don't know how to coach this very well. So first of all, this video is going to help you know exactly how I would cue it, but we're going to go through it together as a group in a second here. But you should be feeling right glute max with your left abdominals, and you might feel a little right outside hip too. So let's do this. Let's get into that position. I would love to coach you guys through this, because again, if you can't do it on yourself, good luck doing it with a client. So get yourself 90-90. You want something underneath your left oblique, like a like a pillow, or a small book is probably more uncomfortable. And I'm going to get you guys to feel this right glute. If you can do this, I highly recommend you do, because even if you've done it before, because trust me, I bet you that there's something you can pick up. All right. So 90-90. Now, this is what we want to do first. We're going to try to create a neurological association between the right glute max, the right foot arch for toe off mechanics, and also we're going to get left internal rotation. It was opposite of the left AIC right here. So step one, make sure that you're perfectly 90-90. Step two, make sure that your knees are in line with your hips and your feet are also in line with your knees. Make sure your left hip can be on the ground. That thing is only underneath your left lowest rib cage and oblique. Step two is now tuck your hips a little bit. Just a little bit, don't overdo it. Now push your right foot arch into the wall. Just create that association. Feel that right glute start to work a little bit. Push your right foot arch into the wall. Feel it working. Keep your left foot flat on that wall. Just see if you can get your right glute to just like get a sensation in it. Okay. Now I want you to push that right knee forward ahead of your left knee, keeping everything on the wall. Don't let your feet move 1 inch. Get that right knee to move ahead of the left. And then once you feel that, you should feel your left adductor kick on. And now slightly externally rotate your right knee by rotating it up towards the ceiling without moving your right foot. Good. Now you should keep your hips slightly tucked. You've got right glute max, left adductor, and now you should exhale. Breathe like you know how until you find your left obliques. Hold on to those as you pause, then inhale through your nose, and you should feel that expansion happening in your right side. Do you need a flat wall? Yes. And I bet you there's going to be someone here who can't feel it very well. And we're going to troubleshoot, which is good, because I want you guys to know how to be able to do that. Who does not feel this like they thought they would? Julia, go ahead and mute yourself.
So it feels great in the right glute, but I don't feel the left side at all.
Your left obliques or adductor or both?
I feel the adductor, but not the obliques at all.
Okay, do you have anything underneath your left side?
No.
I would get that. And then exhale longer, and then that should do the trick. So try that. I'm going to mute you really quick, and then I'm going to see if anyone's not feeling their right glute. Give that a shot for like 5 breaths and just exhale longer. Does anyone else not feel their right glute as much as they thought they might? No, am I that good of a coach? I doubt it. Someone didn't feel it. Huh? I guess not.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can feel my right glute, but I can't get the left adductor.
Okay. Okay. We'll go through it. Let me unmute Julia really quick. Actually, I think she has to do it. Julia, give me a thumbs up if you feel more left abs or still not yet. Still not yet?
No.
How much are you exhaling? Let me see your exhale. Give me a nice open mouth. That's it. All that air out. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep
I
going.
already felt it.
What's that?
I feel it. I feel it now.
Yeah.
Wow. Holy.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the breath
Just the
change.
breath.
Ah.
Breath. Mm-hmm. All right. Who's up next? Jacob, I'm gonna make you spotlighted. All right, let's walk through it. Let's see what you're looking like.
Okay, I'm not sure if you can see me properly.
Yeah, that's gonna be better.
I can't really get a better angle right now, so
You're good, man. Don't
yeah.
worry. Now let's just see what we can find. I'm not really gonna say anything. So walk me through what you're thinking about, Jacob.
Yeah, so I'm feeling my left foot just slightly on the wall. Now I'm pushing my right foot on the wall, like more firmly, let's say. Getting my right knee forward here. And now I feel the right glute. And you said before that I should be feeling my left adductor now.
Correct.
Which is not happening.
Okay, I want you to bring your right foot a little bit higher on that wall there.
Yeah.
Make sure your right foot is straight. Now I want you to bring your right foot ahead of your left. Stagger your stance so your right arch is in line with your left toes.
My right foot should be more forward.
Mm-hmm.
Not above the
right.
left.
No, like you want it to be, like that. Okay. Now keep those hips tucked. Drive that right knee forward. Drive that right knee up. Now try to keep your left heel pressing against that wall and try to lift your left knee up.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Almost got a cramp.
Yeah. Now you got it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, cool.
Good stuff.
Thanks.
You're welcome. All right, got a couple more questions here. I'm going to answer them. Does limb length play a role in promoting ER or IR, such as long femurs promote more IR, or is femur position always a result of natural pelvis position? I would say that taller people tend to be more narrow in nature, who tend to have longer limb lengths, if that helps. But I personally have not really measured limb lengths enough to have a confident answer on that for you. I can just say that usually taller people tend to be narrow and they tend to be biased towards ER. If you have compensatory strategies and are trying to balance it out, will walking worsen or benefit it? Should one be aware of what they need to? Yes, great question, Don. Thanks for bringing this up. We don't hit this concept until the last week, actually, but the goal is to not think about movement at all. You want to have unconscious competence. So the goal would be to not the reason why these exercises have so many things going on in them is because they have so many different systems of the body that we're trying to respect. So for example, when I do that right glute max, I'm educating my brain to, when the foot is pronated and on the big toe, to create that glute max propulsion and pelvic ER. So when I get up from the floor, I shouldn't have to think about it at all. So there's actually been some research that suggests the more you think about movement while you do it in terms of gait, the more inefficient and less really the worse your mechanics are. So the goal should be, I don't want you to think about what you're doing when you're walking. I want you to just walk. And then let the exercise take care of itself, because we've created a change within the nervous system and skeletal position. I have a player who cannot descend in body weight squat more than 90 degrees. Is that because pelvic ER? That person probably can't access recounter nutation. Probably. They're probably stuck in an anterior pelvic tilt. Yeah. These drills are way harder than powerlifting. Yeah. I've been doing this one for a few weeks to help my left foot toe off in IR. After a week or so, I started feeling that pinch you talked about earlier in the left medial hip. Since then, I still get the pinch every so often, but I can know it has helped. My popliteus doesn't catch nearly as much as the ones did. Yeah, so if you're feeling that pinch in your medial hip, I would probably put you in less hip flexion so that you don't have to risk that. Because the deeper you get into hip flexion, the more likely you are to impinge on the superior rim of the acetabulum right here. Should your left leg be off the ground? No, I usually keep my left leg flat. If you have someone biased towards ER on both sides with a tight posterior pelvis, would you avoid this exercise at the start? Probably yes. Or I would at least open up their pelvis first with like a 90-90 like hip lift or whatever to open up this. And then I might do some right glute stuff to re-educate the right glute in a better position. Thanks, Arvid. If you are feeling TFL on the side lying 90-90, would that indicate you lack hip flexion? Yes. I would not put you there at first. There's so many other things we can do to get that right glute to work. Can you walk me through one more time? I feel pinching in my bottom and top hip. Nathaniel, I would bet that you just don't have the hip flexion to be there. We can try. Where are you at? There you are.
Right here.
Yeah. All right. So let's just see what it looks like.
Let's see where my pillow go. All right. So you told the other gentleman to kind of offset his stance on the wall, correct?
Yeah.
All right. So I'm offset, push, kind of drive forward a little bit, and then lift towards the ceiling. And then from here, what was the next step?
You should feel right glute and left adductor right there already.
I feel a lot of right glute, not a lot of adductor.
All right. Let's have you let your head drop down to the floor. Good. And then, yeah, support it like so. I'd have you get maybe a little bit closer to that wall with your hips. Yeah. And now I want you to drive your right knee so far forward that you feel that left adductor turn on, hopefully a little bit before you lift that right knee up. So drive that right knee forward, like kind of roll the right hip over the left. And that should allow you to feel your adductor a little bit on the left.
Not that much, not at all, really.
Keep driving that right knee forward. Are you at end range there?
That's about all I got.
Yeah, okay. Now try to lift your left knee up without letting the right knee come back.
Yeah, that's pretty difficult.
What do you feel?
I feel like I can't move anywhere.
Yeah. So do you feel adductor or do you feel TFL on the left?
I feel more TFL.
So yeah, you are someone I would not put in this position right away because I think it's too much hip flexion for you personally. But there are other things we can do to get you in a better position. You could try a hook lying position. You could try, there's a lot.
What is a hook lying position?
Hook lying position is just like this, right? I'm just giving you like ideas of things that don't require a lot of hip flexion. The one I would probably do like this right here. If you guys want to go through one that I think would be potentially appropriate for you, it would be this right here. Let me pull it up on my YouTube. I'd be curious to see what this does for you. And again, I haven't assessed you, so I'm not
Right.
positive.
More for just a coaching perspective to make sure I'm saying the right stuff.
Oh man, I think my computer just froze. Am I still live with you guys?
Yes.
That's so weird. My mouse just totally stopped working. Hang on. Try turning it off and on. There we go. I was just lagging behind really hard. Okay. We're back. All right. I think, what's going on right here? I need to pull up. I'm sorry, guys. This is bizarre. Hang on. Okay. I'm just going to walk you through the drill. All right. So I just need you to find a wall. And I'm going to use this as my wall. So you want something underneath your left knee, like a little pad or something? I'll use a book. So left knee's bent slightly, or not slightly, but at 90. Right knee is almost fully unlocked, but not actually, almost fully locked out, but not actually locked out. Then what you want to do is drop the right hip slightly lower than the left. And that should give you a little bit of adductor right away, just slightly lower. Kind of like that.
All right.
You feel that a little bit?
A little bit more, but not, I don't think I'm feeling what I'm supposed to be feeling.
Okay. Drop down to your elbows a little bit. And then extend your back. And now slightly tuck your hips as you drive that right foot into the wall. You should feel a lot of lower right butt cheek.
There's the adductor too.
There you go.
And then the breath from here will be the same as before, the long exhale.
Yes.
All right.
There you go. So that'd probably be a better one for you to get in because you can leverage that hip shift easier. And
Yeah,
your right
it's
hip.
definitely a lot easier to get into.
Yeah. So I'd say
Another one. I tried your wall drill with the foam roller, and I felt like I was going a centimeter at a time, back and forth. And it feels like a very similar position.
Yeah, but I think that's a good alternative. If you guys ever have someone that can't really feel the right things in that position, just get them out of the hip flexion and just drive it in that position. All right. I'm trying to see where we are at. Is only the rib cage supposed to expand and not the obliques? So like it depends like who you are and like where you're, but essentially like exhale, find your obliques, hold on to them as you inhale, and you should have a simultaneous rising and falling of your rib cage and belly to some extent at the same time. If I exhibit left AIC and have relative femoral ER, is that why I tend to have tightness in the posterior glute med? Would these fibers be concentrically oriented? I always lean towards thinking my right femur was internally rotated and those fibers were eastern. No, I think they're probably the opposite. Yeah, you're probably, if you're CJ, are you narrow? Wide. Okay. So in that position, your posterior glute med, you probably do have like, they could be eccentrically strained for sure. I'd have to assess you to know for sure with that. But just spitballing here and giving you my best guess, I would probably lean towards those being, because remember your pelvis is still internally rotated on the right. Femur is externally rotated and adducted. I agree with the limb length with taller people. Yeah. What's about to put a tennis ball between the heels for more torque? Are the feet too narrow then? In terms of what? Gravity, coach? You can unmute yourself or you can just put it in the chat, but I'm not sure what you mean by that. But putting a ball in between the feet on that right glute max activity, you could do that. I've never needed to, but I could see it having some value. Aren't side-lying exercises a little bit ineffective overall for narrows? As in, wouldn't it be more beneficial to try to achieve the same thing lying on the back? Not necessarily. Laying on the back is a posterior expansion. So I wouldn't want to expand a narrow if they have posterior expansion, anterior compression. They're not going to feel too good trying to expand their anterior rib cage in that position. I would get them prone, or side lying is really effective, because if that person has secondary compensations, getting them in a position where they are side lying is going to help get this back, which is fine, because if they have secondary compensations, there's bigger fish to fry. We want to get anterior to posterior expansion back. Side lying is the best place to put someone who's got a lot of issues, because it's the easiest to breathe in for most people. If you use the sideline glute hip shift activity with a wide ISA who's already compressed, wouldn't that be just feeding more compression on the left side when they need more expansion? That is why we want to clear people bilaterally first as much as we can. And as we get deeper into unwinding people, the left AIC is what underlies a lot of this. So we have additional compensations built up. So if we keep removing the layers of compensation, the left AIC will be left underneath. That's why the first two phases of my progression involve bilateral things on both sides in most cases, because that's going to help downregulate the tone so we can get to the left AIC underneath the surface. Good questions, guys. Really nice. Can you cover an example of a prone breathing position you would use for a narrow ISA? For sure, that prone right propulsion one right there. Also, all four breathing. This right here. Also, this can be effective. Rock back positions, or you could get into a plank-like position like this, and you can reach like that. Now you're prone. It's just all about gravity. How often do you actually see that single layer of compensation? Almost never. People compensate based off of their sport demands, their life demands, what they do in the gym, etc. And that's okay. A lot of people have tertiary compensations that have no pain. That's why posture is not correlated with pain. It's more so like the movement restrictions and what the demands on the system are. Any other questions? I love the participation. You guys have really good questions. I feel like I see a lot of girls who look like wides. They are triangles with a Q angle and narrow at bottom. So Q angle, as we'll get into later in this course, is just representative. Like they always say females have wider pelvises, right? In some literature, they'll say guys have more narrow pelvises, but they're looking at the inlet, not the outlet. These are wider hips because this is childbearing hips. But if you look at what happens with this, the femur goes outwards, you see an increase in Q angle here. But if you were wide and you were to do this, you could say that's more of a narrow pelvis. Up top, down below, it's more wide. That's the IPA. But then you pick up leverage for less Q angle because now you have a straight line down. Does that make sense? So girls that look like wides probably are either, it depends like what age, have they been pregnant before? Have they given birth? Things like that. And also like what kind of population of females is this? Is this people who lift a lot of weights? Is it people that are like some type of athlete? Often fat loss clients. Yeah, so if you see, I guess this is a good time to talk about this. If you see someone who is significantly overweight, borderline on obese or more so, these people will look like wides because really like what they're doing is like their gut is pulling them so far forward that they are going to be in this and just to stay upright, they got to be so concentric. They're going to be really extended. And to be completely honest, with people that are like very overweight, it can be very challenging to get these changes to stick because when they stand up from the floor, they still have X amount of weight pulling them into extension. So a lot of the best weight loss stuff is also the best biomechanical stuff to a certain point. And that's not a cop out. That's not me saying like, you can't help these people. You definitely can, for sure. But it's going to be a little bit harder with them than it is someone who is like an average body weight. Why are concentrically oriented muscles oxygen deprived? I think that would be a good one to shelve for a later date. I don't want to give you guys too much to think about, but just think about it like this. If you're concentric, then you're creating compression in a muscle. If I squeeze my bicep right here, then that's going to create a lack of blood flow restriction out and potentially in, depending on how constricted that is. So you're not going to get the oxygen resupply and delivery and clearing of the waste products. Is it correct that narrows tend to have overactive external obliques? Shouldn't we be trying to turn them off more? Yeah, you can make the argument they have overactive obliques to some extent because that's their compensation, right? They're trying to close their infrasternal angle so that they can create that exhalation strategy. That's why you want to do a sigh with them, because that's what allows them to not kick them on excessively. And then when they inhale, if you're putting them in the right position to manage gravity, you're gonna get the expansion that you want, especially with the reach. I don't try to turn them off. In fact, with a lot of them who have secondary or third or more layers of compensation, I'll still have them feel their abs when they inhale. I've had no problems with that.
I guess I'm getting at you cue it so everyone feel their abs. Isn't it keeping the compensation going? I hope you get me.
Not necessarily, because you still need your obliques to exhale, like in normal long exhalations. That's their function. So
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a bad thing per se, but with those people, like they usually have bigger fish to fry. They usually have more things in their rib cage that are restricted that are causing them issues more so than than what their obliques are doing, because they have a very distended diaphragm. So exhaling for a very long time is very necessary for them. And then that's going to allow them to ascend the diaphragm. And then we can worry about, if that's still an issue down the line, I'll address it probably more so at the end. So weight loss clients, how much emphasis do you have on actual weight loss activity compared to movement efficiency work? Would general weight loss activity check that? Yes, pretty much, Nathaniel. Because with those people, like I'm going to do a combination of both, but I'm going to let them know, like, I'll say it nicely in the sense of like, hey, you know, the general idea is that we're going to try and restore your movement, but if you're constantly being pulled forward by your body weight, we're only going to go so far. Especially if these people sit all day, it's just like, man, what can you do? You know, you're trying to really overcome a lot of hurdles there. So I will put a massive emphasis on weight loss, but in like a respectful way. Why does supine position open up the posterior rib cage? Wouldn't it close it up? No, so if you're laying on your back, gravity's pushing down to compress here, but the back is on the ground, right? So wouldn't that restrict expansion? No, because the amount of expansion that actually happens is not enough to be blocked by the floor, and all like your viscera, your tissues, pressures are pushing down, which overrides it anyway. It's like the water bottle analogy. So just think about it like that. And really, like when you breathe in, how much does your posterior rib cage actually move? Not that much. So getting that expansion is not going to be limited by the floor in most cases. The exception to that rule would be is if I pushed myself like with a good bit of force up against the wall, then it would be much harder. Or like a bench, like a barbell bench press or dumbbell bench press. That would be an example of when you would not get as much. Can we go back over the relationship between who biases mid-stance of gait and the respiratory bias? Yes, so narrows, remember, pelvic external rotation, primarily right off of the gait like this. You're gonna have external rotation at the femurs, the tibias, supination at the foot, higher arch. You should see more heel strike with those people. Wides, they're gonna be more mid-stance because this happens, which closes this. Brings it into internal rotation down the chain, pronation at the foot, mid stance for wides. Assuming nothing else is going on. If I'm biased more towards early mid stance on the right and late stance on the left, do I need to do a rear foot elevated split squat to the right to drive more late stance and a front foot elevated on the left? Yep, pretty much. If you are going to be biased towards like the normal left AIC orientation, and that's where you're at, and that's really what you need, doing a rear foot elevated split squat on the right will help push the right side, push back to the left. Whereas a front foot elevated split squat on the left, if you add a hip shift into that, you're going to be driving that concentric adductor and pull to the left in that side. And we'll get into the front foot, rear foot, all that stuff. We'll get into a ton of that. But essentially all it's doing is biasing what pressures can go on your foot, what your shin angle is, and what's happening at the pelvis. Do you think one could make a prediction of success for kids in sport based off of their ISA? Oh, that's tough. I think there's more that goes into it than ISA, honestly. Like, I think the ISA is a lens. It's not the end all be all. It's a way that we can look at what potentially the joint actions of this person, what maybe sports they might be potentially better at, but there's so many other things that goes into it, like, you know, like just mentally and also genetically, just in terms of their gifts and how good their coordination is, things like that. Any other questions? I hope you guys meet with your small groups this week. This is a good thing to work through with the study guide, with the quiz, all that good stuff. I'll get this thing uploaded as soon as possible, but it'll probably take a couple hours to process. Anything else? Going once? Going twice?
Yeah,
Oh,
Connor, I have a...
Oh, sorry, Antonio, one sec. With the heel spur, or did I miss it? So with the heel spur, that's probably going to be someone that is a late stance foot. Usually because that person does not have proper heel strike mechanics. So they might feel pain on their heel because they don't have the joint actions to feed down the chain to actually work, right? So that they might be, when they do strike the ground with their heel, or maybe like they're just not bearing nearly as much weight on the heel, they're not going lateral heel to the ball of the foot. Those people are usually going to have some issues and they might feel pain in their heels. The other case is because the plantar fascia is going to be stretched out all the way. Their calves are going to be concentrically oriented. The other thing is someone's biased towards early stance and can't pronate. So they slap the ground with their heel. They can't get the pronation and yielding effect. So their foot is very rigid, which can contribute to that as well. Go ahead, Antonio.
So just going back to my issue, left AIC pattern, assuming that that's what it is. I move relatively well compared to maybe 6 months ago. I never squatted before, never deadlifted, and I do all of that now practically with no pain. My left ribs are still kind of flared up a little bit, or actually they haven't really changed, but they're definitely flared. I can't feel any left abductors doing some of the exercises that you have posted on Instagram. I've tried a few things, but I can't really feel them. I also don't feel expanding my right side, right obliques or right anything. But I don't have much or any of the pain that I've had experience for ever. What do you recommend I should kind of focus on or kind of like play with, I guess? Should I just wait for the rest of the course, or should I start working on something specific to try to just, I don't know, do something? I didn't mention earlier, I also have bunions, but they actually resulted from just walking around. I've worked in restaurants for years, tight shoes and just walking around all day, coupled with the running, and then, you know, just life. Any suggestions, any feedback?
Yeah, I think, have you tried that left adductor pullback? That was the second exercise?
Yes, I'm sure you're familiar with David Gray's program, his first, yeah, so I've tried that and that changed my life, and that's kind of how I found you, and then here I am now. But things are kind of like still not in place where I, hopefully would want them to be. But yes, I have tried that one.
Do you feel your adductor working pretty well on that?
Yes.
Okay. I would do that to prime yourself. And then I would be driving pelvic internal rotation with you. But I think to get yourself to get a little bit of expansion in your right side, you could do this senior portrait drill that we'll talk about later on, where your right leg is out in front, left hip is an extension, lean into the right side, reach with the left arm, digging down for adductor on the left. So you're getting compression, expansion, expansion, compression. And then you can breathe through this. I think that would really help. Then I'd probably load you. I'd probably drive a staggered stance deadlift position to get you some IR on that back left hip, like your Camperini deadlift or whatever people will say.
Yep.
These right here help you own it and incorporate the adductor. So let me send you that senior portrait activity in the chat right here so that you have it.
Awesome. Thank you.
I will actually link it. My internet's still weird, but I'll link it in the Slack chat.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. I have problems seeing whether a tibia is an IR or ER. Can we go over this again, please? Yes. Let me share my screen. Okay. So if you were to draw a line right here with the tibia, look at how it is more so on the right side. I think you can see this. The right tibia is more of a straight line all the way down. And in terms of the left or the right femur, that's turning outwards more so than this tibia. Same with me on the right side. You can see that the femur is out, tibia is in and going down. If I drew a line, where would the line go? If the line deviates outside of the mid shin, like it does right here, that's a tibia, that's probably an ER. The earlier this line gets outside, the more ER is in that tibia. The more that this is a straight line from the middle of the patella all the way down, the more that tibia is in IR. Can we actually help old people with just breathing without lifting? Yes, for sure. Yeah, definitely, Don. Do you have video links assessing, recognizing left AIC patterns? We're going to do that a ton in the review sessions. I can't think of anything off the top of my head like that, but we're going to do so much of this stuff. So many assessments, so many interventions. That's coming up. What do you do with people who have those curved tibias? Restore proximal structures first, then restore. If that's still an issue, I'm going to go after tibial IR with a lot of mid-stance foot-specific stuff. I'll break out the Gary Ward wedges. The more knee flexion you get, the more your knee bends, the more that's tibial IR. So you could drive like a narrow stance split squat, driving the knee over the toe. That'd be a lot of tibial IR too. When would it be good to read What the Foot? I've actually never read What the Foot, so I can't really answer that question. I've taken all of his courses. I just haven't read his book. How to incorporate open chain exercises with people. Open chain exercises I like for training like swing mechanics more so, and getting more like, because whatever side is in more hip flexion, that side is in more ER. So if I was like left foot forward, right foot back, that's what it would be. So if I wanted to drive pelvic ER, doing an open chain activity where you're like this or whatever, it's going to drive ER on that leg more. Good questions. All right, guys. Anything else? Good 2 hours. That was nice. Going once. Going twice. All right. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your week. I'll see you Friday. Please show up for that. We're going to do a ton of fun stuff. Go over the study guide. I hope you guys meet with your small groups, and I will see you in a couple of days. Have a good one.